This is part 2 of our middle childhood cognitive development lecture. So now we're starting to see advances in cognition. This comes into the IP theory. Remember, IP theory was the one that talks about our thoughts as though we're a computer. So in middle childhood, we really see an advancement in what's called metacognition. This is essentially thinking about thinking. So it's awareness of and control of one's cognitive abilities. It involves the intentional use of cognitive strategies to solving problems. You understand how your brain works, and you can use that understanding to help you solve problems. So teaching students metacognition improves their performance in reading and other areas of education. You're teaching them how their brains work and how to best use their brains. So part of metacognition is called metamemory, which is thinking about memory. So this is the knowledge of the functions and processes involved in the storage and retrieval of information. It's how to use memory. So the use of cognitive strategies to retain information. So middle childhood, they start to understand how memory works, and they start to use complicated strategies to help them remember things, such as rehearsal, which is saying something over and over to yourself until you remember it. They also start to recognize that new mental activities can interfere with old ones. So, for instance, if you're trying to remember a phone number, you need to write it down before you start a new mental activity like doing a math problem. So in middle childhood, we see a lot of advancement in the way they think about their own cognition and their own memory, and they're starting to be able to use different strategies and apply those to different situations. So now we're going to go into school skills. Language and literacy. We're going to start with vocabulary and grammar. By age 6, children have a vocabulary of about 10,000 words. By 7 to 9 years old, children realize that words can have different meanings. So I told you they enjoy jokes that play on that, puns, knock-knock jokes. By age 11, jokes that have ambiguity of grammar are funny. So they like things that play on grammar. For instance, I saw a man eating lion at the zoo. Big deal, I saw a man eating snails at a restaurant. Or another example would be, make me a glass of chocolate milk. Poof, you're a glass of chocolate milk. So they really like these jokes that play on words, play on grammar. They also show a great advance in grammar. They can use passive sentences now, which they weren't able to in preschool. So remember, these are sentences like the truck was hit by the car. And they'll start to use more connectives, like I'll eat my spinach, but I don't want to. They can connect different thoughts into a single sentence. Okay, so we see a lot of advancement in grammar in this age. Reading skills and literacy. There are a lot of cognitive skills involved in reading. Reading depends on perceptual, cognitive, and linguistic processes. A lot of different parts of our brains all have to communicate with each other for us to understand what we're reading. They also need to be able to integrate visual and auditory information, what you see and what you hear. They have to be able to make visual differentiations, see the difference between letters and words, such as a B versus a D. During the preschool years, most children have the visual differentiation skills to identify letters, but this gets refined in middle childhood. The best way to improve reading skills is to read. Read books at home, read to children. That's the best way to get them better at it. Okay, is to practice. Okay, phonics versus whole language. Most of you were probably taught using phonics. Phonics teaches children to sound out or use what's called decoding words. So you learn the sounds of every letter or every combination of letters, and you use all those sounds to put them together to figure out what the word says. So if you find a word you don't know, the phonics approach would be sound it out. Word recognition in the phonics approach is essentially just memorizing what words look like. These are called sight words, and they really push kids to memorize these smaller words. Whole language, on the other hand, is an approach that relies on context of the surrounding words to identify a new word. So if they see a new word that they didn't know before, the phonics approach would say sound it out. The whole language approach would say, well, let's look at the sentence. What word makes sense here? Look at the picture, look at the paragraph, look at the whole context of that word to figure out what that word should be. These are two very different philosophies when it comes to reading, and there are pros and cons for both of them. Children who are taught phonics tend to be better spellers, but they tend to hate reading. It's like the phonics has made reading a chore that they have to do. It makes it work. Children who are taught to read using the whole language approach tend to love to read, but they're really bad spellers. They don't know how to sound things out in the same way. So I have a discussion here. I'll post this up on Blackboard. How are you taught to read? Do you think one method is superior to another? I'll get that up on Blackboard and you can tell me what you think there. Okay, reading comprehension. So now that they know how to sound out a word, assuming they've been taught phonics, they have to know what that word means. They can figure this out by the context of the sentence or just by expanding their vocabularies, just learning more words. Their language skills improve. Okay, their vocabulary increases, so they're able to understand the words that they've just decoded, the words they've sounded out. This allows them to more easily figure out a word from the context. They also understand more about grammatical structures, which help them understand the entire sentence. For example, the passive sentences again. Young children can't understand the car was hit by the truck, but in middle childhood they can figure that out. So their language skills as a whole are improving. This helps them read. It helps them understand what they're reading. They're more skilled at recognizing words. So when they can't recognize words on sight, when they can recognize words on sight, they can take the energy that used to be used to decoding that word to figure out what the word means, and instead they can put that energy into understanding the word and understanding the sentence. So there's only so much energy they can dedicate to reading, and if they don't have to dedicate that to sounding out words, then they can focus on meaning instead. They also have more general knowledge. They're gaining more knowledge about the world and how it works. They have knowledge of their physical, social, and psychological words, and this allows them to understand more of what they read. As you learn more about the world, you understand more about what you read in books. Even though a first grader might be able to figure out every word in a sentence about an advanced topic, they wouldn't be able to understand it because they don't have enough experience or knowledge about that topic. So in middle childhood, as they're gaining more knowledge, they're better able to understand what they're reading. Experience with reading strategies. This kind of fits into the metacognition. As they gain experience, they learn new reading strategies and when to apply them. So they take into account the goal of the reading and the nature of the text, and that changes your strategy and how you read it. For example, you're going to read a textbook a lot differently than you would read a novel. And in middle childhood, they start to recognize the difference in those strategies. And also part of metacognition is monitoring your comprehension. They learn to recognize that they don't understand something. Before this, if someone's child's reading a sentence, they'll just sort of plow through and read all the words and just keep going whether or not they understand it. Now they're able to kind of stop and say, wait, I didn't understand that sentence. Maybe I need to read it again. Maybe I need to look up a word to see what it means. Instead of just going ahead with the story, they can stop and make sure they understand something. Writing. Knowledge about topics. As children get older and they gain more knowledge about the world, they have more to tell. They have more to write about. They get a greater depth of understanding. They can explain things in different ways. So you see their writing become a lot richer and more interesting. They're able to start organizing their writing. So as children age, they have different organization in their writing. Young writers use a strategy called knowledge telling. They just write down information as it is retrieved from their memory. It's sort of a train of thought. There's no obvious structure, they just write it as it comes to mind. An example from a second grader might write, "It is a rainy day. We hope the sun will shine. We got new spelling books. We had our pictures taken. We sang happy birthday to Barbara." They're essentially just writing sentences as they come to mind. They're not putting any structure or thought into their writing. A more advanced strategy is called knowledge transforming. Children start to use this at the end of elementary school, so getting toward puberty. They decide what information they want to include and how to organize it to make a point. This involves considering the purpose of the writing. Is it to inform, to persuade, to entertain, etc.? And they realize what information they need to fulfill this purpose. This also involves considering the intended audience. You're going to write something differently for a friend than you would write for a teacher. And so they're able to take all of this information and write better. They're able to give a purpose to their writing, to organize their information rather than just writing whatever comes to their mind. There are some mechanical requirements in writing. As you probably know, writing is more difficult than speaking. You need to know spelling, grammar, and you have to form the actual letters with your handwriting, and those fine motor skills can be hard. It can be hard to actually write the words on the paper. So when children really have to focus on the mechanical requirements of forming their letters, their writing usually suffers. So once they master their handwriting, their writing improves and they're able to dedicate more of their mental energy on content instead of the writing itself. Last is math. So they need to learn to count, and they do this in preschool. At first you need to know one-to-one correspondence. You need to know that numbers go in the same order every time, and that the last number you say is the number of objects you have. So once you have all these skills, you can count, and this is usually developed in preschool. So by kindergarten, most children know how to count, and they use it as their first tool in adding. So some different adding strategies are counting all and counting up. Okay, so when asked a problem that involves adding 4 and 2, if they're counting all, they'll put up 4 fingers on one hand, 2 on the other, and then count all the fingers in order to add. That's the counting all strategy. Next to come is counting up, where they would just start with 4 and then say 5, 6 in order to add. As children gain proficiency in adding, they don't need the counting strategies as much, and they move to mental math. They can memorize sums and they can do them without counting. However, a lot of people still use fingers to count. This is normal. It shouldn't be shamed, especially in elementary school students. It's just another tool. More sophisticated math, multiplication and division, and then they move on to more advanced concepts involved in algebra, geometry, trig, calculus, etc. Symbolic thought is needed for the higher maths, such as geometry and calculus, and this is not developed until adolescence. So while a elementary school student could be taught to memorize how to solve an algebraic equation, they wouldn't truly understand what's going on. They don't understand the abstract concepts involved in algebra. So drill and grill. Many math teachers rely on the practice of drill and grill, which may take the form of flashcards or endless worksheets. But this strategy isn't really effective in teaching math. Some teachers think that having children memorize math facts will lead to understanding, but this is not true. Memorization comes from mastery, not the other way around. If children are taught to understand the fundamentals of math, then they don't need to memorize. They just know how to do it. So if grill and drill doesn't work, what does? I could spend a very long time talking about this, but they just need to understand the concepts of math. They need to understand the fundamentals. If they understand math at a conceptual level, then they can figure out how to solve the problem. They don't really need to memorize it. So many of you probably memorized how to do algebra, but you really didn't truly understand what was happening. So children need to be taught conceptual math first, and then once they understand that, you give them the names and the symbols and the steps for what they're doing. So we should allow them to use tools to solve math problems, drawings, manipulatives, counters, etc. They should be given word problems first and let them explore it and figure out how to construct their own knowledge of math. If they can build their knowledge this way, it will last longer and they'll have a deeper understanding of math and they'll do better at it. So I think in this country we really need to revisit how we teach children math. Okay. Our next topic will be intelligence, and we will cover that in the next video.